It's not working. Good evening, everybody, my fellow errorists, and welcome to the Library of Mistakes. I need to begin with thanks, which is to our usual drinks sponsor, Kennox Asset Management. Thank you, Kennox Asset Management. It seems like a long time since we've been here, but it's good to have you all back. I'm delighted this evening to introduce a man who really does need no introduction. And I was wondering why he doesn't need any introduction, because I think it's unlike most economists. He's actually engaged in the public sphere for a very long time. And when I was reading John's bio, it was in the 1970s that he was already involved doing practical things with economics in terms of tax. And then he set up a consultancy company for the 80s and 90s, advising companies. He's been on the board of investment companies, operating companies, advised the Scottish government, advised Westminster with the Kay report. I remember a few years after the Kay report asking you, when do you think it'll be implemented? And you said, after the next crisis. Well, here we are. You can maybe talk about that at the end. So John is one of those rare things an economist known to the public because he engages with the public. And his desire to do that hasn't changed, and that's why he's here tonight, to discuss something that about economics which probably needs changing or should be changed. John, over to you. Do you want this? You have it here?
Well, thanks, Russell. And the Library of Mistakes, as I understand it, is here to not so much celebrate, but certainly learn from the various mistakes that have been made in financial history. And there's certainly quite a lot of them. And we're going through quite a lot of them now. And it may be that we haven't learnt anything.
I'm terribly sorry. My mic has come off. Do you mind if I'm terribly? Just remove that from there. Just take that off there. Sorry, we'll take that one out. My apologies. Okay. Joys of technology. There you go.
Okay, the game ends halfway through with the Duke ahead. How should the pot be shared? And that was a problem that was set for Pascal and Fermat, and they came up with an answer to it, which is that actually the first application of something which a century later became known as Bayes' theorem, and it's the fundamental building block of a great deal of probabilistic reasoning. So that this was the beginnings of the mathematics of probability. And people applied the mathematics of probability in a wide variety of contexts after that. There was an Englishman called John Graunt who actually went round the graveyards of London and noted down the ages at which people died. And that was the basis of the first mortality tables, which became ultimately the basis of the life insurance industry, which is a large part of what goes on in Edinburgh, as a matter of fact. So these mortality tables were assembled by estimating probabilities of death from this observed distribution. And as things went on over the subsequent couple of hundred years, people used probabilities more and more. There was extraordinarily a man called William Gossett, who, if you do a statistics course, you will learn about student's T, which is a property of statistical distributions. Student was actually Gossett, who was a manager in the Guinness Brewery in Dublin, and he came up with lots of statistical analysis to monitor the quality of beer. But the Guinness family wouldn't allow him to publish under his own name, so he invented the name of Student as a pseudonym with which he published his various results on this. And probabilities became more and more used in industrial processes. Many of you will have heard of something called Six Sigma, which was invented by Motorola and applied famously by Jack Welch at General Electric, again to control manufacturing processes. That is, the use of probability became more and more extensive as the centuries rolled on. But actually, there was some opposition to this, opposition from within economics. And in 1921, there were two books published by incredibly different people, one American, one British, attacking the ways in which probability was being extended.
A measurable uncertainty, or risk proper, as we shall use the term, is so far different from an unmeasurable one that it is not, in effect, an uncertainty at all.
This was Frank Knight, who was an American. He was actually a farm boy from Iowa, who eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And he published, it was his thesis essentially, a book called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And in that book, Knight argued not only was there uncertainty, that is something that could not be measured. There was a difference, he said, between risk and uncertainty. Risk is something that you can define probabilistically. Uncertainty is something that you can't. And Knight went on to argue that the existence of uncertainty was part of the dynamic of a market economy and a financial system. In the same year, there was another book published by John Maynard Keynes, a famous economist, but then not yet a famous economist. He was famous then, though, for the book he'd written, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, denouncing what had happened at the Treaty of Versailles. And Keynes, you will see, said something rather similar to what Knight said.
By uncertain knowledge, I do not mean merely to distinguish what is known for certain from what is only probability. The sense in which I am using the term is that in which the prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper, or the rate of interest in 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of invention, or the position of private wealth owners in the social system in 1970. About these matters, there is no scientific basis to form any calculable probability whatever. We simply do not know.
One thing you might notice at the foot of that slide is that I actually thought for a long time that this extract came from Keynes's 1921 book. It might have, but it actually didn't. It came from an article he wrote in 1937, summarizing for a wider audience what he'd written about in his famous General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. And we can see from that, in a way that I think people have not properly noticed, that this distinction between risk and uncertainty was actually fundamental to Keynes's whole economic thought. But actually, things moved in a different direction. During the Second World War was really the beginning of American hegemony in economics and finance. And that was symbolized in a way at a post-war conference which was held in Paris with a mixture of European and Americans. The three Americans I put on one side of the table and the three Americans on the other. 4 of the 6 people at that dinner party would subsequently get Nobel Prizes. So it was quite an intimidating group of people. But the host was Maurice Allais, and he posed what Allais was inviting them to discuss was the way in which probability and its application to economics had been developed by Savage, particularly Friedman, and 2 others in America, von Neumann and Morgenstern, refugees in America, who had developed an axiomatic theory of probability, what we now call in economics subjective expected utility, as a basis for making decisions under uncertainty. What Allais did at this dinner party was he posed a number of paradoxical questions for people, asked them how they would decide whether to take particular risks or not. And he showed that they didn't actually correspond to the theory of subjective expected utility as the Americans had developed it. What happened then? Well, the Americans went home. Savage then wrote a letter saying that he hadn't really meant to say what he had said on that particular occasion, and he stuck by the approach which they had adopted. And actually, that's how things developed from then on. In the 1950s, Milton Friedman, who was at that dinner party, who rather paradoxically succeeded Frank Knight as kind of doyen of the Chicago School of Economics, in 1962, Friedman would write...
In his seminal work, Frank Knight drew a sharp distinction between risk as referring to events subject to a known or knowable probability distribution, and uncertainty as referring to events for which it was not possible to specify numerical probabilities. I have not referred to this distinction because I do not believe it is valid. I follow Jimmy Savage in his view of personal probability, which denies any valid distinction along these lines. We may treat people as if they assigned numerical probabilities to every conceivable event.
So you can see the extension of these ideas of probability from Pascal and Fermat in France in the 17th century to, in the mid-20th century, the idea that probability theory is a universal tool for dealing with risk and uncertainty. And what Friedman's argument there, that says we can treat people as if they assigned probabilities to every conceivable event, that has been the basis of economists' theories of decision-making under uncertainty, and the basis of almost all of financial economics ever since. You might notice a curiosity, which is people have interpreted Allais and that dinner party as being the beginning of what people now call behavioral economics, which says that people don't necessarily behave according to the axioms of rationality. What Allais was arguing was that this was actually because the model was simply not a good description of how people behave. Over the 20 years that followed, that was turned on its head. So the argument of behavioral economics now is not, is that the problem, if the world and the model don't correspond, the problem doesn't arise with the model, the problem arises with the world. And people don't follow the model because they're stupid, and they ought to be knocked on the head until they do follow the model. So you can see how far and how extensive this adoption of probabilistic reasoning as the basis for handling risk and uncertainty has gone. And you can see from the Vineyard quote with which I began, how that underpinned so much of so-called risk management in the financial sector. I want to start you thinking, because many of you, I suspect, will have been accustomed to the idea that we can think about these issues probabilistically. I want to start by challenging people who think that with one or two difficult problems. Oddly, Russell mentioned that I was on the board of one or two investment companies, one of them Scottish Mortgage, and I first encountered this particular paradox over dinner after a Scottish Mortgage board. And this had apparently been set as a question for people who were looking for positions in the management company of Scottish Mortgage. I have two children. In fact, I think you met Lucy. One of them is obviously a girl. What's the probability that my other child is a boy? And at that dinner, there was actually heated argument over this, because one school of thought said the probability that any child is a boy or a girl is 50-50. And the fact that one child is a girl doesn't affect it.
That is working. Yeah, sorry. Think of the fun we're having here. I'll just take that down. I'm sorry again. Apologies for this.
Right, so we now know it's not boy-boy. So it's either boy-girl, girl-boy, or girl-girl. And therefore, it's the probability that my other child is a boy is 1/3. Seems equally good reasoning. And how many would go for a half? How many for a third? Can you try? Hands, please. Right. There's a. I know it. Right. It came up at another event at which I used this problem. I think we're going to have to change it because the idea that there are two genders appears no longer to be to be acceptable in all circles. I'll give you another problem instead then. There are two envelopes. I tell you that one of these envelopes contains twice as much money as the other. You open one envelope and you discover it contains £50. So now I say, would you rather open the other envelope instead? The other envelope has either £100 in it or £25, and you don't know which. Hands up if you'd choose the other envelope. Hands up if you'd stick. Slight majority for switching the other envelope. But if you switch to the other envelope, that means that whichever envelope you choose to begin with, you will actually select the other one instead. And that doesn't make sense, does it? You'll be kind of horrified to know that there's actually quite a substantial literature in mathematical journals on this particular problem. And what we should learn from these kind of problems is that actually people's estimates of probabilities are incredibly sensitive to the precise specification of the problem and the context within which it faces. Would you change your answer if you opened the first envelope and discovered there was £1 million in it? Well, again, it's a matter of understanding problems in context, and you can only frame probabilities, and you will only think of framing probabilities if you actually know the context. We'll do this one instead. My flat in London is above a betting shop. And every time I enter or leave, I pass that betting shop. And it displays in a window the odds I can get on various horses. Are we in trouble again? If I attached probabilities to every conceivable event, as Milton Friedman says I should, I would look at that window and say, Dobbin, 40-1 for the 3:30 at Kempton Park this afternoon. My subjective probability that Dobbin will win this race is quite a bit higher than that. I think this is a good offer. And then following day, I'd see something else and say, no, that's not an interesting proposition, and so on. But I don't have these subjective probabilities. I don't know enough. I don't know anything about Dobbin's prospects in the 3:30 at Kempton Park. And not only would it be, am I not required as a rational being to go in and place a bet or decide not to place a bet, it would actually be very foolish for me to do so, especially in a world where other people know rather more about Dobbin's prospects than I do. And this has probably never been better expressed than by Humphrey Bogart.
On the day when I left home to make my way in the world, my daddy took me to one side. Son, my daddy says to me, I'm sorry I'm not able to bankroll you to a very large start, but not having the necessary letters to get you rolling. Instead, I'm going to stake you to some very valuable advice. One of these days in your travels, a guy is going to show you a brand new deck of cards on which the seal is not yet broken. Then this guy is going to offer to bet you that he can make the Jack of Spades jump out this brand new deck of cards and squirt cider in your ear. But son, do not accept this bet, because as sure as you stand there, you're going to wind up with an ear full of cider.
What Scott Masterson is explaining in Guys and Dolls is that almost every bet you might take, there will be someone else on the other side of it. and that someone else may well be willing to take the bet because he or she knows more about what is involved in this than you do. So it's not only not required by rationality that you attach probabilities to every conceivable event, it would actually be foolish to attach probabilities to every conceivable event. Now let me go back, if I can, to another problem which I'll pose for you. And this problem is a well-known one in behavioral economics in various versions. Linda lives alone, read social history at Anglia Polytechnic, and she was active in organizing demonstrations against Shell. You were then asked, which do you think is more likely? 1, Linda's a bank manager. 2, Linda's a bank manager who is who's a leading member of the Women in Banking feminist organization. 3, Linda's a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front. Let me test you. How many people think she's a bank manager? How many people think she's a bank manager who is an active feminist? How many people think she's probably a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front? Interestingly, we have a majority here for the bank manager. We have a few people who think she's a bank manager and a feminist, and we have a few people who think she's a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front. Now, the answer you're given in behavioral economics to this is that obviously the right answer is she is a bank manager. And the argument there is that it is impossible, since there are quite a lot of bank managers who are not active feminists, it is impossible for it to be more likely that she's a bank manager and an active feminist than that she's a bank manager. And then there are a lot of bank managers, and there are extremely few spokespeople for the Animal Liberation Front. So it is much more likely that anyone you don't know about is a bank manager than that they are a spokesperson for the Animal Liberation Front. But actually, the reason so many people give what is treated as the wrong answer to that question is they don't interpret it as a question in probability. They distinguish between probability and likelihood quite sensibly. And the story, to give you this description, and for me then to say, Linda's a bank manager, sounds odd. It doesn't fit together as a convincing narrative. You wonder, I need to know more about Linda in order to make sense of this story. If I then left you in the room to talk to Linda, you probably wouldn't say, how were things at the bank this morning, Linda? You would ask a few further questions in order to establish that this further information you had been given was actually correct. I think we need to think rather harder about the language which we use to talk about risk and uncertainty. I want to restore that distinction between risk and uncertainty that Knight and Keynes emphasized and Friedman and the others tried to elide. I want to distinguish likelihood from probability. Likelihood is application of general knowledge, of value, expression of land, application of my general knowledge of the world. Let me offer another problem of these kinds. Is Philadelphia the capital of Pennsylvania? Well done. But if I apply but if I ask what is the probability that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania, that is an absurd question. Philadelphia either is the capital of Pennsylvania or it's not. many of you in this room will not know whether it is the capital of Pennsylvania or not, or what is the capital of Pennsylvania. It is, in fact, not Philadelphia, it is Harrisburg, in case anyone. But it is absurd to talk about the probability that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania. But it is not absurd to say it's quite likely that Philadelphia is the capital of Pennsylvania, because the general rule that says the largest city in a particular state tends to be the capital of that state will serve you rather well. I could give you the further piece of information, which is that if the capital of a state was selected probably in the last couple of centuries, it's less likely that it's the largest city than if it's a more historic capital. So in Britain we have London, in Germany you have Berlin, in Paris you have France, and so on. But in Australia you have Canberra, in the US you have Washington, and in Philadelphia you have Harrisburg. So I can say this is likely or less likely from the basis of my general knowledge of the world. And as I expand my general knowledge of the world, I can say that increases or reduces the likelihood. Now, that's not a number. It's a ranking. It's what we call an ordinal rather than a cardinal measure. And that's what we're doing when we talk about likelihood. And people who attach numbers to a great many of these events are really confusing likelihood with probability. There's also the reason for taking that example of Philadelphia and Pennsylvania was that people were also asked, how confident are you in the answer which you've given? And then they were asked another question, which was, what answer do you think other people will give to that question? And it turns out that how confident people are in their answer tells you nothing about the accuracy of their answer. And we can all understand why. We know a great many people who are confident about a great many things, which is not necessarily the same as it being likely that these things are true. It was, who was it? It was Lord Melbourne, I think, was supposedly said of Macaulay, I wish I was as certain of anything as that man is about everything. And what confidence is it's subjective and tells us about the individual who is making the confidence statement. So confidence is different from likelihood and probability. Probable is often used as a synonym for likely, but I wish we wouldn't. I wish we would distinguish likelihood and probability. And probabilities are things that can be derived from known or observable distributions. The context in which it's sensible for us to attach probabilities are things like games of chance. And actually, casinos spend quite a lot of money trying to make sure that their casinos are fair. That is, that the results can be determined by probability distribution. I talked about looking at the distribution of dates of death in order to construct mortality tables. There are quite a lot of cases like that, where on the basis of observations, you can infer a probability distribution. But these things are actually quite exceptional in the world. And we need, I think, a different narrative. Now, in the financial world, people have come to regard risk and uncertainty as being the same, following Friedman and the quote which I gave earlier. And risk and uncertainty are equated with volatility. But we can't actually make that equation. First of all, this means something very different from what ordinary people in everyday language mean by risk. When people talk about risks in normal speech, they're talking about something bad. I've never heard anyone say there's a risk I might win the national lottery. I've never even heard anyone say there's a risk I might not win the national lottery, because people don't expect to win the national lottery, or most people don't. Risk is something bad. Risk is something that hits you on the downside. But uncertainty is something that can have an upside or a downside. You meet new people, you eat at a new restaurant, you go to somewhere you haven't been before, you're uncertain about what you'll experience, and it might turn out to be either better or worse than what you thought it was going to be. So uncertainty comes from ignorance about the future, or indeed in some cases about the present, and uncertainty may be upside or downside. And volatility means something yet different. Volatility is, in finance, means, and ought to mean, the variance of the anticipated numerical outcome. And that's not the same as either risk or uncertainty. We need to adopt a different and more careful language in talking about these problems of risk and uncertainty. That comes to the way we think people ought to approach this kind of approach. Firstly, we have uncertainty, which arises from our imperfect knowledge always about the future and often about the past or the present. So uncertainty is endemic, not just in finance, but in every part of life. Now, there is uncertainty which we can treat as resolvable. And uncertainty can be resolved in one of two ways. One is that you can get more information. You don't know what the capital of Philadelphia is, but you can go to Wikipedia and you can look it up. And that's often the way in which we deal with uncertainty. But there is also uncertainty, which you can't resolve in that way, but you can describe probabilistically. That is the kind of uncertainty which is associated with games of chance. It's the kind of uncertainty which is associated with mortality tables, or something where there is an observable frequency distribution out there in the world. But most uncertainty is not resolvable in either of these directions. And these kinds of uncertainty are what we call radical uncertainty. And radical uncertainty is characterized often by ambiguity and vagueness. Ambiguity and vagueness sound rather pejorative words. They sound as if they're the product of loose thinking or something. But they're not. There's a whole philosophic branch of philosophical reasoning which is to do with vagueness. And its problems like, classic is called the Sorites paradox. If you have a heap of sand and you take one grain of sand away, it doesn't cease to be a heap. And yet there must be some point at which it does cease to be a heap. It's because the concept of a heap isn't and can't be well enough defined for that to have a clear-cut answer. Indeed, if you were to define it, say, a heap of sand contains 15,347 grains, you would have to find some different terminology to deal with things that look like heaps of sand but have slightly fewer grains of sand in them. That ambiguity and vagueness is intrinsic and not product of poor thinking. Often, not all outcomes of an uncertainty can be specified. If I ask, what is going to happen in the Ukraine, then I can't come up with a list of possibilities of any well-defined kind, far less attach numbers to them. And then there are distributions, and this comes back to Mr. Vineyard and his calculations and risk modeling, which are just not stably specifiable. The database which Goldman Sachs were using to construct their risk models was not applicable, was a historic database which was not applicable to the particular situations which were faced in 2006, 2007, and 2008. And that's very frequently going to be the case. So what I'm leading to is saying we need to rethink and be more precise and careful about the language which we use in talking about risk and uncertainty. We need to resurrect that distinction between risk and uncertainty. We need to distinguish likelihood, confidence, and probability. And the way people, not just in everyday language, but even more actually in the financial world, conflate all these concepts. Let me leave you with one final movie clip. If there's a mantra which we would like you to take away from what I've said this evening, which is, it is something like embrace uncertainty, but manage risk. Risk, as I've described, is downside. Risk is based around what we call a reference narrative. It's the story around which you build your business or plan your life. And risks are things that jeopardize that narrative. And therefore you have to try and protect your narrative against these sort of risks. But once you do that, then you can go back to tonight's observation that it was uncertainty that created opportunities in finance. It was uncertainty that created opportunities in business. There wasn't a futures market for iPhones in 1995 because nobody then knew what an iPhone was. And if you had been able to define a futures market in that, then the iPhone would probably never have been invented. That's the real properties of the financial and business world. It's reflexive. What we believe about it influences what it is, and that makes life difficult.
In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock.
Manage risk, but embrace uncertainty. That's the takeaway I'd like to give you from this evening. Thank you.
So this, of course, was written by Graham Greene, and I recently read it in Switzerland, very cheekily. And as soon as I'd finished, a man leant across the table, and I thought, well, now I'm in trouble. And he said, Mr. Napier, we didn't invent the cuckoo clock.
My understanding, Russell, is that although Greene did write the film script for The Third Man, it was actually Orson Welles who wrote that particular paragraph.
I may regret asking you this, but do you think we can do anything to study radical uncertainty? Because I like to think this is a library full of the history of radical uncertainty and everything else. Is it worth studying? Is there anything we can do to understand, cope, manage? What's your opinion?
Oh, there's loads we can do, but I think the largest thing we need to do is to understand real decision-making processes. With respect to this issue, I describe the problem as being that we've taken the view that if the conventional model doesn't describe the world, it's the world's problem and we should put the world right. I think we should do more to develop models that actually describe realistic behavior. I once went to a conference in behavioral economics, talked at a conference in behavioral economics, at which people were sitting round tables in the room. And there were about 50 tables. And each of these tables had on it a sign that was some alleged bias, which people had discovered in behavioral economics. There was the attribution fallacy, availability fallacy, etc., etc. And I asked, if we have so many fallacies, if we have so many mistakes in the way we think about uncertainty, how is it that we're around? The truth is that we have evolved to deal with uncertainty in much more sophisticated ways than these models allow. And that goes back to where I began, which is to say it is extraordinary that probabilistic reasoning emerged so late in the history of human thought. You know, the Greeks and Romans gambled. They had some people who were pretty good mathematicians, and they never discovered this kind of frame of thought. And that, I think, is because other than in gambling type situations, probabilistic reasoning is just not that helpful.
So this might suggest if we did more testing in the real world, we would find out how these decisions were actually being made and learn a lot more from doing that rather than assumptions.
Yeah. And if we look at the financial sector, old-style bankers managed risk rather better than the professional risk modelers who had taken over by the early 1990s and created the world that led to the 2008 crisis.
So in terms of economists, is there somewhere in the world where this is being done, where we're beginning to bifurcate again risk and uncertainty, or is that you've been at this for a while now? Is there any progress?
Not much. Right at the beginning of the book, Mervyn and I described what the reactions we anticipated to what we had to say, which was that people who hadn't been trained in economics would regard this as pretty obvious. You know, what are you saying that's new? Of course, these things are different. And economists would carry on regardless. And that is, I think, roughly what has happened.
I mean, it's particularly interesting coming from you and Mervyn, because you were teaching this stuff once upon a time, weren't you?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
You have changed your mind,
and
has Mervyn.
Yeah, and I think we both changed our minds on a range of things as we got out into something more like the real world and realized that people didn't necessarily, both that people didn't necessarily think in the kind of ways that we were in the models we were framing, and that it wasn't necessarily a bad thing that they didn't.
Now we have a roving microphone if someone would like to put their hands up and ask a question. Usually this audience rushes to ask questions. We're right at the front, David.
Did the man from Goldman Sachs believe what he saw, or he was producing, and do something about it, or did he just forget about it?
I think people basically forgot about it. I mean, value at risk models are still as widely used now as they were then.
It's scary, isn't it?
Yes. Well, that's why you have a library of mistakes, isn't it?
Potentially, is it worse, do you think? I mean, these things, this way of reasoning, isn't it embedded in algorithms, financial algorithms?
Yes, I mean, it is embedded. And we just had, 3 or 4 weeks ago, this liability-driven investment crisis in pension funds, which is another example, I think, of what we see again and again in the financial sector, of people who do things that are quite clever, but they're not as clever as they think they are. And I've always said in another book I wrote that, I was a schoolboy in Edinburgh way back a very long time ago in the 1960s, and then joining the Bank of Scotland or the Royal Bank was a job for the boys in my class who weren't going to get good enough hires to go to good universities. And 25 years later, people who were joining these banks were people with MBAs and CFAs and finance courses. And in the end, we know that they managed the bank worse.
Any other questions? There's a gentleman over here, David, beside the pillar, and then we'll come down to the front, the right of the front row.
How should regulation change to reflect this uncertainty? Because regulation is always backward-looking and perhaps loves those models of certainty.
No, I mean, regulators are pretty much, well, not only adopted these models, but to a large degree forced them on people in the sector. We're just talking about the pensions issue, where regulation has in effect imposed models in a way which has hugely adverse effects. We've effectively destroyed an area of the British welfare system that was working relatively well before quantifiers and people with with these kind of models got hold of it.
Is that the consulting actuaries to blame in this whole process?
The role of actuaries in all of this is rather strange. I mean, when I first encountered actuaries, really in the 1980s, I thought it's terrible that actuaries know so little about economics. Now I worry that actuaries know too much about economics and take it far more seriously than it actually deserves, given the kind of discussion which I've just been going through.
John, our next question comes from an actuary.
Excellent timing. I'll come back to you on LDI later, but initially, is there not a bigger issue behind these crises? For example, lack of regulation, greed that is allowed to be exploited by sales, where people are sold things rather than they actually buy what they need and want and think?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that what I've been talking about tonight is the sole cause of problems in the financial sector. It certainly isn't. Greed is certainly a large problem, although I can, to a degree, attribute that to our models, because we've been developing models that say business and banking is just about short-term profit maximization. And people respond, and more or less exclusively respond, to short-term financial incentives. Well, if you set up that model and run systems based on it, you end up with people who do respond to short-term financial incentives. And that's what's happened in the financial sector. Lack of regulation? I don't think so. I think in many ways regulation has been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We've just mentioned pension funds, in which I think there is no question about that. We've talked about value risk models and the imposition of capital requirements on banks, which these capital requirements have tended to be regarded as maxima rather than minima. And I recall being told by a CFO of one of the major banks that the regulators should have been stricter about capital requirements before 2008 than they were. This is from someone who's a CFO in a bank. It's his job to determine what is a prudent level of capital, not the regulators.
We have another question, front row.
You mentioned in your talk there about old-fashioned bank managers and how they were much more able to manage risk than people who took over. How does that lesson become incorporated more widely in the financial sector? Or should it be, I guess, is the other part of the question.
I think it should be. And I think a whole variety of problems in the financial sector arise from the belief that we have much greater capability to model things than we actually have or ever could have. And the judgment of people who are experienced in this particular area of business is something we should attach more weight to relative to the models of risk professionals. I remember before the financial crisis giving a talk to, it was a group who were basically the legal counsel of many of the large London banks. And what I did, what we thought might be amusing for them, was that I set out to explain value at risk modelling. And what startled me was to discover, firstly, that this had never happened before, that they knew that there were models developed by their risk professionals, but had no idea what the content was. And secondly, when I had described it, they found it hard to believe that the models were, in this sense, as naive as they actually are, and as they turned out to be when the crisis struck.
Is it really about incentives? I think your book, Other People's Money, I think features more on incentives, and it's the incentives that are misaligned, and therefore the regulation is never really going to catch up where the incentives are so bad. And maybe that's the
correct.
difference with all those people you went to school with. They came out in very different incentives.
Yes. They expected to join the bank and, if they worked hard, become a branch manager and retire in 45 years' time with a pension.
I think it was called 363 banking, wasn't it? Take
Yes.
deposits at 3, lend at 6, on the golf course by 3.
And that they probably learned as much about their customers on the golf course as they did in the bank manager's office.
I think we're going to take one final question at the back.
Yeah, just going back to the final bit of your answer to the question before last about it being the CFO's job to determine and ensure that the bank has the relevant level of capital. Isn't the problem, although that may be his job, his motivation may well be swayed by the fact that his performance bonus is going to be determined against a basket of performances with other banks, and if he goes out of line and puts more capital into reserve, and therefore they underperform the rival banks, then he's going to lose out, and perhaps more importantly, his fellow colleagues on the board will also lose out, and they'll put pressure on him too.
I think that's true, and we could spend a whole evening talking about the pernicious effects of bonus cultures across business as a whole, but most of all in the financial sector.
I think we will have to leave it there. Wasn't it Truman who said, "Please send me a one-handed economist"? I hope you take it.
Right. It's attributed to Truman. There's no evidence that he said it. And I think Truman was actually much too intelligent a man to have made that statement.
Well, the great thing about having you here, John, is you're not a two-handed economist for sure. You tell us exactly what you think. It's not on the one hand X and on the other hand Y. And I think we've all got to hope that you make progress with this. And if there's any, I don't know what we can do to help with the library mistakes, but if you can think of anything, let us know. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Russell.
We'll turn you off first.
Right.
Otherwise, everybody can hear you.
I mean, we avoided Gordon Brown.
Yes, exactly.